So today we're going to be talking about the political and social issues surrounding the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. A little bit of background on the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. It's being built on the Blue Nile River about 20 miles south of the South Sudan border in Ethiopia. Once it's completed, it'll be the largest dam in Africa and the 7th largest in the world. The project cost is estimated to be about 4.7 billion US dollars, and the construction began in 2011, and its original goal of completion was 2017, but that's been pushed back to about 2020 to 2022 because of project expansion, including increase in height of the dam and the saddle dam and upgrades to its power generation. So its current specs, the main dam will be about 509 feet tall, about 5,800 feet long, and the reservoir it will create will contain or can contain up to about 13.3 million cubic yards of water, and the main dam can produce up to 15,000 gigawatts of power a year. A saddle dam will also be created, which will house the reservoir amongst the mountains. It'll be consistent of rock and will be about 3 miles long and 164 feet tall. The reservoir's volume will be about 1.5 times the average annual flow of the Blue Nile. So this is going to be a really large resource for Ethiopia. It'll be able to produce hydroelectric power for the nation and leave them with a wonderful water resource in case of emergency, and just a good resource for industry and economics and for drinking water. So the parties involved here are Egypt, Sudan, and Ethiopia. The Blue Nile starts in Ethiopia, runs into Sudan, and merges with the White Nile to form the Nile River that then runs into Egypt. Ethiopia is the builder and the main funder of this entire project, and their goal is to better their stance in Africa, and they hope that this whole project and the formation of the reservoir with it will help them rise from poverty and give them some good leverage when working with Sudan and Egypt. Sudan is the middle grounders in this whole situation. They have positives and negatives that'll come from the GERD's construction, and currently they support its building and they're supporting Ethiopia, but previously they were strongly opposed to it and supported Egypt. Egypt is the main opposition to this whole project. They have the most to lose from the GERD's construction, and they don't trust Ethiopia's intentions, and we'll talk all about this later. So the climate along the Nile kind of split into two different regions. The Ethiopia and southern Sudan area consist of a semi-arid tropical climate with precipitation in most of the year, and that precipitation is pretty well spread throughout the year. Egypt and northern Sudan are kind of the opposite. It's more of a desert climate, and they rely on one rainy season a year, and if that season has very low precipitation, all their water resources will be significantly stressed, especially Egypt, because the Nile is Egypt's lifeline. They rely off of it for their agriculture, economy, to water their people. The majority of Egypt's population lives on the Nile. About 95% of their total population live within a few kilometers because this is their main water resource. So Ethiopia has a lot to gain from this project. The water that they'll gain from the reservoir will help their economy grow faster. Currently, they're the fastest growing economy in Africa, and with this water resource for industry and economics, will solidify them as a economic power in Africa. Currently, less than half of their people have power as of 2016, and the hydroelectric power from this dam will be more than enough to rise the standard of living for the average citizen in Ethiopia, and they'll even have a surplus of power in which they could sell, bringing in more money into the region, and it'll be a huge source of drinking water as it's fresh water. Currently, a third of their people don't have access to safe water, and having this large fresh water reservoir could really help their people have a safer source of drinking water. And this dam will give them complete control over the flow of the Blue Nile. The Blue Nile contributes 86% of the Nile River's volume, and if they're able to cut that off or control it, they'll have a major strategic resource in any kind of diplomatic relations with Sudan or Egypt. The Ethiopian people also have quite a bit to lose from the dam's construction. About 20,000 of their citizens will be displaced by the reservoirs that floods where they currently live. A lot of agriculture downstream of the dam's construction relies on seasonal flooding to bring water and nutrient-rich sediments into their fields, and that seasonal flooding will be lost with the construction of the GERD. Fisheries will also be affected because the Blue Nile's velocity will change with the construction of the dam as they try to fill the reservoir. And there's a lot of unknowns with the construction of this dam. Ethiopia has done very little research into ecological effects the dam will have on the region, and any findings they've currently found they've been pretty secretive about. So with this new dam's construction, Sudan will have a lot of stresses alleviated from their dams, such as the Rosaries Dam pictured below, which is the next dam downstream of the GERD and the first dam in southern Sudan's borders on the Blue Nile. It will benefit from less sedimentation because the GERD will stop a lot of that, and they'll have to deal with that sedimentation. And they'll also have a resource to refill the Rosaries Dam's reservoirs in times of drought by releasing some water from the GERD's reservoir in times of low precipitation. The GERD will also provide flood protection for southern Sudan that isn't currently protected by the Rosaries Dam. And but Sudan will have some negative effects too. They'll have reductions in seasonal flooding, just like Ethiopia after the GERD, and this will affect their agriculture and fisheries along this section of the river. As of March 2012, Sudan has supported the GERD's construction because of the benefits I've listed above, and this is after the ministers of water from Ethiopia, Sudan, and Egypt all met and kind of discussed the positives and negatives. They decided to support Ethiopia where they had originally opposed them, and supported Egypt, supporting what Egypt had believed, which we will get on the next slide. So I personally believe Egypt has the most at stake with the Grand Renaissance Dam's construction. Water availability will be reduced for the country while the GERD's reservoir fills. It's been calculated the reservoir will take about 5 to 15 years to fill, depending on precipitation in the Blue Nile's watershed and Ethiopia's restriction of flow on the Blue Nile every single year to increase the flow or the filling of its reservoir. Egypt's claiming a permanent reduction of water availability may happen due to increased water evaporation upstream where this new reservoir will be located. Egypt's also looking at a decrease in their agriculture and industries and hydroelectric power for the whole nation because the whole nation relies on the Nile River currently. And Egypt claims that their total power production, not just their hydroelectric power, would drop by up to 3% with this lower water availability. But Egypt could also benefit from the GERD's construction. Just like Sudan, it could have reduced sedimentation due to a lower velocity or controllable velocity at Egypt's Aswan High Dam, which is one of their most important dams for hydroelectric power and just flood control and a water resource because it forms Lake Nasir, this really large reservoir that Egypt depends on. If it was properly coordinated, Lake Nasir actually could benefit because it's located in a more desert climate where evaporation of surface waters is greatly increased compared to Ethiopia's climate. So more water was held, and the GERD's reservoir, just regular evaporation of water could possibly be lower. And even though Egypt's not talking about that, they could actually have greater water availability due to a decreased lack or loss from evaporation. So these social and political conflicts over water in the Nile region goes way back. In 1929, during colonial occupation, an agreement was made to where Egypt would have complete control over the Nile's waters during the dry season. This was amended in 1959 in the Nile Water Agreement, where Egypt was allocated the vast majority of the Nile's annual flow, and Sudan was given a pretty hefty portion too, which accumulated to 99% of the Nile's annual flow, leaving all the upper riparian countries, Ethiopia, Uganda, Kenya, Tanzania, Burundi, Rwanda, and the Democratic Republic of Congo to spread 1% of the Nile's annual flow. And this didn't take into account annual changes in flow due to differences in precipitation, droughts, all of that. If the change in flow changed, Egypt and Sudan were still allocated the exact amount of water, even if it didn't exist. Ethiopia and these other countries were angered by their lack of representation and no allocation of water that flowed through their countries to themselves. So in 1999, the Nile Basin Initiative was started, where these upper riparian countries proposed equitable shares of water spread throughout all the countries so they could all benefit from the Nile and its tributaries. And Sudan and Egypt refused to agree, citing their historic agreements that gave them complete control over the waters. Forgot to include, the Nile Water Agreement gave Egypt the right to veto upper riparian projects in any of these countries. So if any of the countries wanted a dam or put any kind of project on the Nile or use some of the Nile's waters, Egypt was given the sole right to veto these projects. And these countries, of course, didn't like that either. In 2010, the Cooperative Framework Agreement was signed by all these upper riparian states, including Ethiopia, which created a commission of individuals from all of these countries to manage the Nile's water resources and split them as they were needed between the countries. Once again, Sudan and Egypt refused to sign, citing their historic agreements to water from 1959. With no progress being made with Sudan or Egypt, Ethiopia decided to take the water allocation problem into their own hands by starting this Grand Renaissance Dam by surprise without any consultation or notice to its allies, investors, or neighbors. Norway itself was blindsided. They had invested over $2 million in two other dam projects in Ethiopia along the Blue Nile, and the GERD's construction rendered them completely obsolete. So Norway lost all of that money and all of their investments in those projects. This surprise construction obviously enraged Egypt and Sudan because this threatened their historic water allocations. But they agreed to an international panel of experts, which consisted of Egyptians, Sudanese, and Ethiopians, along with third-party professionals, to look into the information that's been gathered into the construction and the impacts of the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. They found a severe lack of hydrological and environmental data, and any that was already found was really hard to look at. Ethiopia refused to release the information they had found, and more data was unlikely at the time because Ethiopia was threatening anybody who was trying to look into the dam's construction. They actually imprisoned one of their own journalists in 2011 after they raised questions about the dam's construction plans. They also threatened the staff of International Rivers with death threats when they attempted further studies on the dam and its potential reservoir. So current attempts at resolution. The Tripartite National Committee was formed between Sudan, Egypt, and Ethiopia in 2014 with the goal to conduct studies recommended by that panel of experts. Not all of the meetings end successfully, or they haven't in the past, and there's been very slow progress made into following through with studies on the dam. Tension has risen and fallen between these meetings between the countries. Egypt has threatened to leave these talks multiple times and have ceased communications for months at a time. Conspiracy of sabotage to the dam have been formed many times, even with the point of a Egyptian politician being caught on live television talking about, jokingly, supposedly, of sabotaging the dam's construction. As of 2019, further consultations and studies are still being planned, looking into the hydrological and environmental impacts of the dam, and if its current specs are reasonable and safe for the region. No agreement has been made on the GERD's design yet, or how they're going to allocate the water that the reservoirs formed and how fast they will be able to form the reservoir. Egypt is really wanting a reduction in the dam height so they can reduce the total volume of the reservoir. Like I said earlier, the current reservoir design could hold 1.5 times the annual flow of the Blue Nile. So they could completely shut off the flow of the Blue Nile River if they wanted to, and no agreement yet has been set on how quickly they will fill the GERD's reservoir. So one potential solution to this whole issue would be Ethiopia to give in to Egypt's demands, which would include lowering the height of the dam and the saddle dam to reduce the total volume of the reservoir, and to allow Egypt inspection of the dam's designs and studies around the dam, on hydrological and environmental impact. Pros of this would be less environmental and social impact with the reduction of the reservoir's volume because of less flooding of land, destruction of habitat, and this would really please Egypt, lessening political tensions because Ethiopia would be less able to disturb the flow of the Blue Nile, lessening the impacts they possibly could have on Egypt's industry and power production. Cons would be less power production, industry, agriculture, and drinking water for Ethiopia's people, so lessening the positives for Ethiopia totally, and also leaving less of a safeguard during times of drought, leaving less potential to refill reservoirs downstream in Sudan and in Egypt, along with leaving less water to help Ethiopia's people when water and precipitation is running low. It also leaves less of a buffer zone and buffer capacity to resist flooding in the upper stream areas between Ethiopia and Sudan during times of high precipitation. In my opinion, the best solution would be for Egypt, Sudan, and Ethiopia to cooperatively operate the dam and maintain the current design and reservoir size of the dam, and let the three nations determine the annual discharge volumes from the GERD based on all of their needs. Pros of this solution would be annual discharge volumes could be adapted to each country's need each year if there is lower precipitation in the watershed area for that country. More water could be released to refill their reservoirs before they hit critical levels, allowing them to continue with their hydroelectric power production and giving them water for their people and for their industries. Also, the GERD's reservoir would lose a lot less water than downstream reservoirs that are located in the desert because the GERD is located in a more humid environment, which would leave a larger volume of water every single year that would be available and not lost to evaporation. All nations could also benefit from the hydroelectric power produced by the GERD. It's projected that the 15,000 gigawatts a year will be more than Ethiopia can use, so they can sell it to neighboring nations, allowing them to also have a higher form of living and increase their economy. Some cons is it would take longer for the reservoir to fill potentially, maybe greater than the 15 years because Ethiopia's dam would constantly be discharging water based on need to Sudan and Egypt also. Also, the three nations don't have a great history of cooperation as we've seen. If you look into different historic conflicts not involving water, you'll see that Egypt and Ethiopia have had several conflicts throughout centuries. So if communications broke down between the three countries and they no longer cooperatively operated the dam, it would leave Ethiopia with a strong strategic piece over the other two nations and the ability to disrupt over 80% of the Nile's annual flow. And this could lead to violent conflict between the nations in order to control the flow of the Nile.